Welcome to Campus Compact 2022 Conference, a better way forward, innovation with equity at the center. I am Cynthia Lynch, the Executive Director of the Center for Civic Engagement and the Frederick E. Berry Institute of Politics at Salem State University in Massachusetts. I have worked in the field of civic engagement for close to 30 years, and I'm very passionate about its future. I am here today with a group of faculty and civic engagement practitioners to speak about how our field of civic engagement is at a critical juncture in our history. In order to meet this moment and achieve a just and equitable democracy, we need to examine our praxis and language and ensure we include voices from diverse genders, races, professional status, geographical locations, age, and all who want to be included. History is remembered for how we meet these critical juncture moments. And throughout history, innovation has often aided our ability to meet these moments by expanding access to the sharing of ideas and bringing new people into the discussion. We saw this in 1933 when President Roosevelt began his fireside chats and connected the White House to everyday Americans in ways that had never happened before. I imagine all sorts of new family and community discussions were sparked by these fireside chats. In 1960, the first televised presidential debate occurred between Vice President Nixon and Senator Kennedy. This innovation allowed a larger swath of the nation access to the ideas and policies of political candidates and altered the structure and campaigning, placing more emphasis on crafting an image and gaining media exposure. In the ensuing years, the innovation of the internet and social media, while harmful in some ways, have also provided an opportunity for youth and other marginalized players in institutional-based engagement to influence and express their voices in ways they were never able to prior. And today, at a conference with innovation in its title, we are going to use the innovative technology of Hublot throughout this week to convey the diversity of voices shaping the direction of our field. The field of civic engagement is at a critical moment in its history, a history that is centuries old, with its origins steeped in the community engagement and advocacy of Black communities, HBCUs, land-grant institutions, and community colleges. In fact, the powerful reign of the service learning nomenclature and its corresponding activities are not more than 40 or 50 years old. However, during this short period, there have been several convenings to discuss different crossroads in the field and make important decisions. In December 1988, there was the Wingspread Conference that discussed how to renew the civic mission of the research university. And in February 2008, there was a meeting on why the civic engagement movement in higher ed has stalled and what to do about it, hosted by the Kettering Foundation, among others. These meetings were cultivated by the renowned experts in our field, who invited their peers who were also prominent civic engagement scholars. Often presidents, provosts, deans, senior reps from professional organizations and private foundations were also invited. The common thread in the invitations to these critical meetings was the predominance of white attendees from primarily white institutions, not all, but primarily, which means the conversations were predominantly filtered through a white lens based on white history and not inclusive or open to all the voices in the field. We are here today to amplify the important conversation that is occurring across the country in our field and encourage all attendees to participate in and to examine how civic engagement praxis and language can center equity and identify the ways words and practices may hold us back from achieving a just and equitable democracy. Today and throughout the week, in the Choose Your Own Adventure sessions, we are going to offer open discussions on how you envision the future of civic and community engagement. How does the work in our field challenge the status quo? And how can our practices be more responsive to social and structural inequities? We want to dive into how our language centers social justice and ensure the work we are doing with our students, faculty, and communities is anti-racist and responds to real issue. These questions highlight the critical moment our field is in. And in order to move forward in a just and equitable way, we need broad participation, many voices, and creative and innovative ideas. In a few moments, a panel moderated by Dr. Elaine Ward will begin this discussion in a public way and model the openness of ideas and brilliance of diverse voices. Then today at 1 p.m. Eastern, Wednesday at 1 p.m. Eastern, and Thursday at 1 p.m. Eastern, members from this panel will host open discussions during the Choose Your Own Adventure sessions to brainstorm our future. Using Hubelo, an innovative platform popularized during the pandemic, we can hear from anyone who wants to be part of this conversation at this important moment. No invitation necessary. But we don't want this moment to end at this conference. We plan to continue building a coalition of people who want to explore these questions and be part of the movement to ensure that our field centers equity in language and in praxis and challenges the status quo so that we can find a better way forward together and hopefully achieve a more just and equitable democracy. Now I would like to introduce Dr. Elaine Ward, who will present our panel of civic engagement scholars and begin this important conversation. Dr. Elaine Ward is an associate professor and chair of the Higher Education Department and serves as special assistant to the president for civic and community engagement at Merrimack College. Elaine has served on the board of ISLICE, the International Association for Research on Service Learning and Community Engagement, and currently serves on the National Advisory Committee for the elective Carnegie Community Engagement Classification. Now I'll turn it over to Dr. Elaine Ward. Thank you, and I look forward to seeing you throughout this week.
Thank you so much, Cynthia. And thank you all out there for joining us today. And a special thank you to all those who have gone before us in this work, both in the United States and globally. It is my pleasure and privilege to introduce our guests today. Rochelle Smar is the director of the Department of Service Learning and Civic Engagement at California State University, San Marco. Her role involves oversight and administration of all civic engagement programs and service learning courses for the campus. Rochelle currently serves as an educational, or is currently an educational studies candidate at UC San Diego and California State University, San Marco, and is expected to receive her doctorate in 2024. And Rochelle also plays a huge leadership role on the board of ISLICE. We're really thrilled to have Rochelle with us today. Dr. Aaliyah Baker is a faculty member at Cardinal Stritch University in Milwaukee, Wisconsin, where she teaches graduate courses in educational leadership, language, and literacy. Aaliyah earned her PhD in curriculum and instruction with an emphasis in multicultural education from the University of Wisconsin-Madison. Her research interests include critical race theory and the social contexts of schooling. Dr. Baker, thank you so much for being with us today. Dr. John Reiff has worked with civic and community engagement for over 40 years as a faculty member and as an administrator. Since 2015, he has worked as the Director of Civic Learning and Engagement for the Massachusetts Department of Higher Education, where he helps civic engagement champions build capacity for their work at the 29 public colleges and universities in Massachusetts. His current work focuses on bringing civic engagement into statewide higher education framework of equity and racial justice. We're very pleased to have Dr. John Reiff with us today also. Dr. Cindy Vincent is Associate Professor of Media and Communication at Salem State University. Her research focuses on critical engaged civic learning, civic media engagement within historically marginalized populations, and the use of dissent in digital democracy for negotiation of political power and social change. Cindy's work has appeared in the Michigan Journal of Community Service Learning, the Journal of Alternative and Community Media, and the International Journal of Game-Based Learning. Cindy, thank you so much for being with us today also. We have a series of questions that is going to set us up for our dialogue today, and we'll carry these questions into the conversation with those of you who are participating. And as Cynthia mentioned, we'll carry those conversations into the dialogue through the Choose Your Own Adventures over the next few days. Thank you to Campus Compact for facilitating the opportunity to engage in this dialogue. Turning first to Dr. Baker, please share with us today how language matters for you in community engagement work, especially as we consider how language helps or hinders us in centering equity in that work. Dr. Baker?
Thank you so much. Such an honor to be here. My work explores the relationship between social and cultural issues and human experiences stemming from the influence of race as an ideology in this country. Considering that I know that about equity, it isn't just about the language we use. It is about how we use that language. It is about decentering an overwhelmingly corrective and regulatory practice of inclusion and exclusion. Language matters in community engagement work because it is the moment I can use words to actually transmit feelings and lived experiences that can't be felt in the absence of the emotion and the pain that has been endured. I think it's important to keep saying that some things over and over so that we don't forget that while we may have equipped ourselves with certain terminology and have all learned the same words to use in the spaces we feel most comfortable using them in, we have a long way to go to justice. There is a white, racial, male, gendered hierarchy that exists on most college campuses that continues to ostracize and exclude Indigenous knowledges and perspectives of disenfranchised people. And while some might say, yes, we know this is the case, that doesn't mean we stop saying it. That just means we need to say it more. Because apparently, if we're saying that is still the case, we haven't dealt with our social and cultural issues well enough as a country, as a nation. We haven't been able to break into the world of high stakes and urgency or increased scrutiny to the point that the inequities go away. As there becomes heightened global awareness of the disenfranchisement of people who hold less power and less privilege by design, the shareholders on community engagement work, on community should feel empowered to just keep saying what needs to be said until we see something otherwise. I think the language I use in my work must name and frame issues directly. It must also be emotional and authentic in order to center the kind of poetic justice and activism I hear resounding as emotional, spiritual, authentic remedy for my soul, thanks to the linguistic prose of people and thought leaders like Tupac Shakur and Akala, whose work I just adore right now. When language is used to speak truth to power, that is equity. And that is the equity we need in community engagement work. When the written and spoken collective experiences of the soul of a nation can uplift and empower people to do something different, where we have opportunities for a community on the margins of power and on the margins of privilege to realize and recognize equity, that is justice. And that is why we center language at the core of lived experiences and knowledge, promoting and sustaining a field committed to equity. In the field of language and literacy, language helps to unpack some of those sign systems and symbols inherent in our interactions with one another that continue to perpetuate exclusion on college campuses. I operate with and within community, and I remember my family, for example, as the community foundation that I come from. So the context of community can shift as we go from one social institution to another, which makes it really difficult to center equity in systems thinking. In the field of education, language helps us center our students' experiences as knowledge in the classroom. Language can hinder us in centering equity in our community engagement work when we have denied and devalued the language of experience. So we might use the same words, but I am very hopeful that we begin to disrupt the ways that language serves to offset actual practice. Saying is not the same as doing. And as a community engaged scholar, I try to use language as a social activity, a sociocultural process to communicate a shared understanding of ideas and feelings about who we are, what we stand for, and what it would mean to actually experience things like equity, inclusion, and justice. For many of us, I think the languages of our sociocultural selves have been excluded historically, and our languages as social identity get demoralized and depreciated in institutional spaces. It is important for me to do the work of community engagement through culturally mediated conversations around power, privilege, and the politics of difference to first and foremost deconstruct in order to secondly reconstruct the ideals and relationships we hold dear to us.
Aaliyah, thank you so very much. We're having some tech issues with John joining us, but Cindy, I'm going to turn to you for a moment while we're waiting for John to be able to get in. Talk to us a little bit about how language matters for you in your community engagement work.
Yeah, thank you, Elaine. I'm in media and communication, so language is very important when I engage in community engaged work. As I'll be talking later on in this session about critically engaged civic learning and the importance of language within that work, just to sort of respond to what Dr. Baker was just talking about becomes incredibly important as we think about centering equity in the language on our college campus. That's something we've been intentionally trying to do at my university, shifting language, identifying areas where power dynamics become increased for certain privileged groups and decreased for those on the margins. And so some of the ways that we're doing that, we start small, right? So at Salem State, we implemented service learning, the idea of service learning across the board. And when I joined in 2013, we used that language in every discipline and every department across the campus. But just a few years ago, when Cynthia, Lynch, and I started to identify the critically engaged civic learning framework, language was the crux of that. Not only in how do we communicate with our communities, and not just to or at, right, but with, having the conversation with, and the language that we use in that, and how our language supports or breaks down power dynamics in those contexts. But we also started to think very mindfully about how we engage the campus community who had been entrenched in service learning for so long. How do we invite them into this new conversation where we were rolling out critically engaged civic learning, which at its core centers equity? It's an equity-based framework. And so in that sense, we've tried to have a very mindful conversation with our campus community about why service learning, the terminology, the language can be very problematic in terms of its history, in terms of its meanings, and quite often times, at least for our university, how it gets carried out. The perspectives that get marginalized as it gets carried out, some lip service that may get paid to ideals that aren't followed through with. And so in our use of language on campus, we've been trying to be, I think, more transparent and more intentional in addressing equity across the board. Thank you, Elaine.
Thank you so much, Cindy. Rochelle, I'll turn to you in a moment. But I do just want to queue up all of you who are in attendance at this session. There is an opportunity for you to contribute comments and to ask questions and enter into the dialogue with us today. So as we speak and as we share, please feel free to make those comments and ask those questions as we go. We will capture them, we'll use them for the dialogue after the panelists share, but we will carry them through our time together over the 3 days and going forward as we continue this conversation and broaden the participation in the conversation as we go. Rochelle, is there anything that you would like to add in terms of language and how language helps or hinders our community engagement work from your perspective?
No, certainly. I do have a little bit to add. I think language definitely matters in the sense that it helps identify who is allowed in this space of civic engagement and who's not in this space. And I think about my own experience on my campus when I think about students of color not knowing what is community engagement, what is civic engagement, what is service learning. Cynthia mentioned this in her introduction of like, there can be a barrier, and that sometimes it's lost in translation, especially in the field of civic engagement, being 40 years old, that there's a pedagogy of whiteness, as Tania Mitchell mentioned. And I think some of that ripples into the current work that we're doing. And so just kind of as practitioners, thinking of what are other ways that students of color are identifying community engagement, and how can we shift our language and our lens to be more representative of what they're interested in and what they're doing. A lot of our work is steeped in charity work and in volunteerism, and it is what it is. That's just the fact. And so I think if we're going to shift toward what Cindy and Aaliyah are saying about critical service learning and transformative critical civic engagement, we need to also reimagine the words that we're using to do this work, that are more inclusive, more equitable, and that are straightforward of like, we want to do social action.
Rochelle, we lost you. Rochelle, we lost your audio. It just cut out. We'll let you. Oh, there you're back. You're back.
I'm back. I was very animated. I'll leave it with this part. I think what Aaliyah and Cindy were saying earlier about how we need to be more mindful of how we include students of color. And so we need to be more informative of how we're changing the language to be more inclusive to what students are doing now. And so we know that they're into social media, they're into doing movement. So why not shift the language to be more about social activism, advocacy, impacting policy? And of course, it doesn't have to be on a large scale, but what are they doing now? And how do we maybe transform the language we're using to entice and engage students to apply their learning in a way that's more meaningful to the greater democracy, and not so much for just one course in one area, but the broader community, the broader civil global community as well.
Fantastic. Rochelle, thank you so much. Cindy, I'm going to turn to you now. As we think about language, it's not only what we say and the words we use or the framing that's behind it, but it's also the work and what we do, right? It is our practice, our praxis. Can you share some crucial considerations that we should have for centering equity in community engagement praxis, right? That critical reflection plus the action from your own experience, and as we think about the doing. Cindy.
Yes, thank you. Yes, and this is the question I have been planning for, right? So to go back to this idea of critically engaged civic learning, let me take a step back now and explain that a little bit more and what that means. So in my work, praxis is key. I'm constantly trying to not only identify best practices in our field, but theories that form those practices. So I'm stemming from a Freire work and a Bell Hooks work, and I'm really trying to think about critical pedagogy as I engage in community engagement. And so these were some of the foundations in the framework for critically engaged civic learning. So critically engaged civic learning shifts service learning from a student-centered pedagogy to an equity-based framework through what we call a stakeholder cloverleaf. So in this cloverleaf, we see representatives from each stakeholder group, or oftentimes than not, when we're thinking about community engagement. So that's going to be community members, or maybe the recipients of the collaborative effort, the community organizations or partners, as we sometimes call them, college students, and then of course, faculty and community engagement professionals in higher education. Through this framework, we view all of these stakeholders as invested partners in the co-design, implementation, and evaluation of a CESOL initiative. And ultimately, CESOL is founded on redistributed power and authority to promote civic learning and social change. We're also seeing it as a way to actualize contemporary calls for leveraging the cultural wealth of our students, particularly our students of color, right? And the cultural wealth of our communities, and viewing that through an asset-based lens, not a deficit-based lens. And incorporating anti-racist practices that work to decolonize community-engaged practices. So for example, understanding positionality, bias, and historic roots of systemic racism in a community collaboration. To go back to Elaine's question, how am I seeing this sort of play out, or what are the things that I'm keeping in mind as I'm doing this work? And so through CESOL, we've identified 6 primary principles here. And the first is social justice. When we engage in social justice in our community collaboration, we're addressing root causes of issues and challenging those injustices. We're not just being bystanders, right? We're taking a stand and we're calling it out. The second principle is power dynamics. As I keep mentioning, breaking down hierarchical power dynamics to leverage equity is key. And in my experience in academia, what year is it? So a little less than 10 years. I've been in this since 2013. And in my experience, in a lot of community partnerships, I have seen other academics come in and assert their expertise as the only one holding knowledge. And that's a terrible way to approach these things, right? If we're using an asset-based lens, it's really about leveraging everyone's knowledges, particularly students and community members and our community partners, and not just thinking about the adults in the room, but everyone who's a stakeholder within this engagement, right? So breaking down hierarchies is key. The third principle is based on community. And as I keep saying, right, it's an asset-based approach. So we're focusing on leveraging community assets, not solving perceived community deficiencies. And I want to take a moment just to sort of, since we're talking about language and language being so important, when I think about community, we're really defining it as a people and a place and the relationships inherent therein. So this is meant to be broad and intentionally inclusive of all the people who live, learn, work, play, and have impact on the local community, to include stakeholders as well as individuals not directly involved in these initiatives. The fourth principle here is civic learning objectives, and this really gets to the pedagogy side of this. So we're looking at the skills, competencies, and values necessary for democratic engagement. Our fifth principle is reflexivity, not just reflection. Reflexivity requires an iterative process that contextualizes knowledge and critically examines our own positionality within the situation. And lastly is sustainability. Quite often we see service learning projects for one semester, or these one-off projects, right? We're really calling for a long-term approach to building a civic ecology through a mosaic of actions. So really thinking about the long-term relationship building that we're doing with our communities, from across the institution to within the institution, across our communities as well. Thank you.
Cindy, thank you so very much. And so to the tech gods out there, and to Zach in particular, we know that we now have Dr. John Reiff queued up on the other end. Welcome, John. We are happy to have you here with us, that you've been able to get in and be with us. I know you've been listening on for a bit while we were waiting for Cindy to finish her remarks. John, please share with us your thoughts. You've been in this work a long time, right? In a number of different roles. So we really welcome your perspective on how language matters for you in your community engagement work.
Thank you, Elaine, for that question and for managing the time while I was in cyberspace using some language that mattered to me that I won't repeat that I got here from. I want to start with a question, and it's the question asked by Rodney King, the Black man who was brutally beaten by 4 LAPD officers in front of someone's video camera. And he asked after that assault, why can't we all just get along? Part of the answer to that very good question is this: we don't have the right language in play. Language carries our consciousness of ourselves and of the world, and among other things, it encodes relationships of power, privilege, and oppression. It's hard to think about something that we don't have a good name for. It's hard to struggle against something that we don't have a good name for. And it's hard to build towards something that we don't have a good name for. And what may seem to be an appropriate name at one time may come to be revealed as inappropriate, inadequate, or just plain wrong. I want to share an example from my work. When I came to UMass Amherst in 2000, I became co-director of a curricular engagement program started the year before by 2 other older white faculty. They had the idea that the program would guide students in developing and practicing the skills of citizenship, as John Dewey talked about, claiming roles as co-owners of governmental structures and collaborating with other people to solve public problems. The program would also guide students in active and critical inquiry into the roots of public problems and into the alternatives that might be used to address those problems. That's a future we all agreed was worth building towards, so I joined them in calling it the Citizen Scholars Program, or CSP. It became the signature program of our service learning office, recruiting cohorts of students who took 4 4-credit courses in sequence together. As time went by, and as the national discourse around immigration began to draw deeper and deeper divisions between U.S. citizens and other people called aliens, students began saying that they loved the program, but they didn't like the name, especially the citizen part. Could we perhaps change it to community? We responded by explaining how, for us, the term citizen denoted active engagement in the co-creation of democracy, and that's an identity we wanted them to take on. We wanted them to use our term to envision possibilities for themselves. What we didn't hear was how the term citizen for them was increasingly contaminated by the national discourse, that it named for them a zone of privilege that excluded people, mostly people of color, who live in this country but were born elsewhere and who were then seen as counting less than those who are citizens. I was the last of the 3 co-directors of the program when I retired from UMass in 2016. The person who took my place became the new director of CSP, a professor of color, renamed CSP early in his first year. It became the Community Scholars Program. He listened to the students in a way that I hadn't. And in that first year, he recruited an incoming cohort of over 50% students of color, a predominantly white program located in a predominantly white university. The name change was not the only reason he was able to change who joined the program, but I am sure that it removed a barrier for many of those students. Language matters. Back to you, Elaine.
It certainly does, John. Thank you so much for that. Before we transition to Rochelle, again, to be talking about the doing of the work, I'd like to pull in some of our participants. So Jenna Alzona talked about performative language is definitely something that affects authentic, equitable change. Thank you, Jenna, for that comment. And Georgina Leal says language immediately draws boundaries, right? Especially for those who know they are not being included. So, yes, John, language matters. Definitely does. Rochelle, can you share with us what you consider some crucial considerations for centering equity in community engagement practice from your perspective and work?
Certainly,
and everybody else,
just to
pressing you.
I forget that there's a delay. I just want to build off of what John said. Yes, certainly language matters, but also representation matters. I still hear, is it me? Let's see. Okay.
John, you got to mute.
So
Yeah, and then
are we good? Perfect. Okay, so certainly, as John mentioned, language matters, representation also matters. And I say this as a woman of color, as a first-generation student, as someone who loves this work of community engagement and civic engagement so much, but yet there are so few practitioners that look like myself. And that is what has led me to pursue my own doctoral work in this field, because I feel like if there were more people who looked like me, maybe more students who want to do this work or have a way to translate what they're doing already in their communities to say, why not get academic credit as well for this? Or why can't I get paid or do some sort of international experience to do service or civic engagement internationally? Like, the opportunities would just be more abound if students saw people who look like themselves, but also if they read about themselves in the literature that we're purporting and sharing with them as well. And so that's my small tangent of saying that we not only need to transform the scholarship and the pedagogy, but we also need to change the practice to be more culturally inclusive, more culturally responsive of the students that we are serving. And so I can say in my prior institutions, once I was hired and as I began to see that they were PWIs, predominantly white institutions, I saw the gap and I saw the need. And the moment that I was, one of those institutions, a student actually emailed me, I'm so happy they finally hired someone that looks like me. I can't wait to get back and start working with you. And from there, it was just a ripple effect of more students of color coming out of the woodwork across campus of like, oh, I didn't know this place existed. I didn't know these opportunities were open to me. I thought they were just for certain students and not for all students. And so I think representation certainly matters when it comes down to the practice, not just on campus, but also in the community. We serve a lot of communities of color, low income communities. And so we have to also be mindful of who are the community partners we're partnering with and what are the mission and values of the work that they're doing and who is at the forefront, like who is their representative that's coming to campus to talk about their project, or who are we sending our students out to work with, and how do we partner with community partners to be more mindful that this isn't just a volunteering experience, but this is an opportunity for students to dive deeper into the social issues and concerns that give them a reason to have to serve in the first place or want to serve in the first place. And I think one way I've heard of this being done is through a community partner institute. We haven't been able to do it here on my campus because we've been virtual, but I know that Dr. Star Plaxton Moore at University of San Francisco State, they have hosted one before. And it was a week-long institute for them to bring their partners to campus and actually dive into the pedagogy of service learning and community engagement so that those community partners were a little more informed of what were the students learning before they went out into the field, and how can they complement and supplement that learning in the projects that they're designing and creating. And that kind of goes back to what Cindy said of like, these are long-term partnerships. When we make an investment with our community partners to say, we want to do this with you together to address an issue, we want to make sure our students are learning and growing and that they don't just walk away saying, oh, that was 4 years great in the city, I'm going to go back to Houston. Like, wait a minute, this has been your home for 4 years. Why shouldn't you want to do more or consider staying? I know that for us at California State University, San Marcos, 85% of our students, of our alumni, stay in this local area. So that's why we used to have a division of community engagement, but we have to also beef up our alumni because they're staying in this area. And so they too can become community partners that come back and work with our students. So I just think there are several ways that we can be a little more equitable and just in how we're we're doing our practices, but it also starts not just at the institution, but how is the institution connecting with the local community and community partners to make sure that it's a reciprocal partnership, and we're not so much saying our students have to learn, but our students also have to learn how to give back selfishly, and want to know how to be active and engaged citizens, and they do this through community engagement. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Rochelle. Patrick Nugent asked and commented, thank you all so much for this really important conversation. Might each of you speak to a particular word or phrase that you believe opens new perspectives when it's peeled back and critically examined? Any words or phrases you use, but that you're now not using or using differently? Aaliyah, I'll turn to you.
Absolutely. I can appreciate that question very much. And I appreciate the focus on looking at the significance that lies within student participation at campuses. But to tie that question in with what we've sort of just centered the discussion around, I would have to offer the phrase committing to an intellectual struggle for freedom. And I think that then lies at the heart of the significance of how institutions are grappling with these ideas of community engagement, and the significance that lies in the geopolitical and the sociographic concerns that really target and address community, where we can then shift and transform communities to rise up, if you will, and offer that sense of protected freedom or individuality or intellectualism that gets lost oftentimes in the ways that we grapple with institutional context. And so I think there's a uniqueness about an intellectual struggle for freedom that lives in a world of arts and multicultural education and literacy and health and education, population density, that we can channel and target the disruption and the objectives surrounding community engagement that really then lie with the centering of that intellectual reality, that there are other knowledges and other experiences that are not coming to the table, coming to the forefront of these conversations. It's an intellectual struggle for freedom. And I'll turn it back over to you, Elaine.
Thank you, Aaliyah. Cindy, do you have a thought on words? I think you've said it a lot in your presentation, but if you had to crystallize it, what word did you use that now you're not?
Ironically, a word I've been moving out of my vocabulary more lately has been the term social justice. And that's more for personal reasons and my own personal encounters with the justice system and our court systems, and thinking about how justice does not serve everyone equally. And like Aaliyah has been talking about, we need to find these spaces of injustices. We need to confront them. We need to address them, right? We need to use our language to provoke, I think, a bit. And so I've been shifting more to social equity instead, and thinking more about equity for everyone and equity across the board, which is why I like the theme of this year's conference, right? That we're intentionally becoming more equity focused. Yeah, so that's my response.
Thank you, Cindy. John, we have a couple of questions in here that I know you will be able to offer a broad answer to, not just from an institutional perspective, but also from grant-funded and state-funded initiatives. But if we could respond to Carla Huffman and Jenna's questions briefly before we turn to our next focus about institutional context and status quo. if you could briefly talk about what kind of professional development trainings do your institutions have to help faculty embrace these ideas, incorporate them into our pedagogy, and how do we help hold the faculty accountable, right? Particularly help them when folks, I won't just say students, but when we encounter people who are using deficit or microaggressive language. So if you could speak very briefly to the professional development opportunities that we have on our campuses, that would be great.
Okay, thank you, Elaine. I have had the opportunity to work with some of the folks on this screen and a number of other folks to do a multi-campus professional development project, which happened over last year from spring through September, in which we asked what are the core principles for anti-racist, community-engaged pedagogy. And we had conversations with students of color, we had conversations with community partners, we had conversations with each other. We came up with 4 principles with about 5 or 6 elements to each principle. And then we designed faculty development projects for each of the 4 campuses and across them, in which we shared these principles with people and we asked them to talk about which of these principles do you already use and what does it look like when you do? And which of these principles would you like to do more of and what might that require? And we had wonderful conversations about bringing that lens. So we also built scenarios of challenge, things that challenge us from the principles, and we talked our way through those. And we have those resources we can share.
Great, John, thank you. And those resources that John is referring to, we will use and share with you all throughout the days in the Choose Your Own Adventure sessions that Cynthia mentioned at 1 p.m. Eastern today, tomorrow, and on Thursday. Did you like that announcement plug for our sessions? In the 10 minutes that we have remaining, please feel free again to share your comments and questions, and I will pull them into the final few minutes of our dialogue. Rochelle, could you talk a little bit about in what ways does the work of civic and community engagement within the current institutional context include or invite opportunities to challenge the status quo? How can the field of civic engagement be more responsive to social inequities like poverty and structural systemic racism? Rochelle.
Thank you, Elaine. I think that's a great question to help wrap up. I think for me, when I think about the current context or how to invite opportunities to challenge the status quo, I think we need to just look at our peers at HBCUs, historically Black colleges and universities, simply because they've been doing community engagement for years, if not centuries. Math isn't one of my degrees, so I don't know how that works. But yes, they've been doing it for very long. And I think we need to invite them to the conversation. They're often not a part of this discourse. And I don't know how often they're invited to do scholarship or partner with some of us at institutions that have a wealth of resources with faculty who are blazing the trail. I think we should invite them and kind of learn what are they doing, because they've been doing this work a lot longer. They are addressing poverty and structural racism in the work that they're doing because they have embedded community service into their mission, into their culture. And I wonder if there are a lot of ways that we can learn to do that in our work so that we don't have such a hard fight to institutionalize civic engagement and community engagement into our work, because they might have a tenet or a way that we can glean from them. I also would like to say that because a lot of our trailblazers are starting to retire, there's this opportunity for us to bring in more mid-career professionals like myself, because I feel like I shouldn't have to have pursued a doctoral degree to be a part of this conversation, but I am. But I wonder if there are others behind me who are like, I just have years of experience and I just want to get into higher ed and help students and work with community partners and faculty. So I think there are many ways that we can begin to challenge the institutional context of, like, it doesn't have to just be scholarship, but it can also be practitioners at the table as well that can leverage their experience and their knowledge just as much as others.
Great, Rochelle. Thank you. Aaliyah, I'm going to turn to you with the same question about current institutional contexts and how we're doing work that really addresses systemic issues and addresses real problems and real social inequities. But I'm going to pull in Kara's question for us to consider as we're answering that broader question about context and community and connection. And how do we do this work, and how do we shift language without alienating people who have used those words for a long time, right? And I might feel that their past approaches are being criticized or are problematic. We want to bring those folks along and help them embrace the new language and the new praxis that we envision for the future. So how do we shift these changes to really help this work and all who want to do it reach our fullest potential for the change we seek to see? How do we do that without alienating folks and keep those connections strong? Aaliyah?
Thank you, Elaine. I think Rochelle is right. I can absolutely agree that we can look to different leadership to help guide and steer the thinking that is probably really lacking in a lot of ways. I would offer an account of how the institutional context of civic engagement is in need of concentrating revolutionary examples of engagement that have yielded widespread results. For example, I would be inclined to offer the life and work of Septima Clark as an exemplar, as a leader, as a social justice warrior in the field of civic and community engagement. Septima Clark led a literacy movement after she was denied a job and compensation in an academic institution because of the color of her skin and her involvement in the NAACP. So we already have opportunities to reclaim narratives that are lacking, that are missing in the work. Septima Clark would never be able to gain the compensation she was denied, to which would impact her financial wealth in this country, her entire family legacy. But there does exist an opportunity to challenge the racial injustice that has been promoted through our generations, through our understanding and knowledges of this field, to put more action into the responses to the social inequities that have already occurred. Within an institutional context, I think we can do better to support, encourage, and promote and nurture those efforts. And to go back to the question that Kara raised, I think it's about reclaiming narratives and listening. I'm sure many of us know all too well that engaging with communities during a global pandemic was no easy feat. Yet the pandemic invited opportunities to challenge the status quo by requiring us to pivot almost instantaneously. We can't ignore the opportunities to do that and to think. I think that we are seeing the reality, although it may not feel good. So furthermore, in terms of teaching through the exploration of those issues, teaching through the exemplary revolutionary examples like Septima Clark, through and with community during global and social crises where social disparities were confounded by civil unrest, we have a need, a critical point of understanding how the social emotional experiences that usually come to pass in learning through pedagogies have withstood the test of time. And what can we learn then from Black people who have withstood the test of time, right? What can we learn from HBCUs who have been doing the work of service through and with and within these notions of speed and agility, humility, gratitude, and patience? Social distancing, changed the community landscape for us all, but I think the impact was greater on our mental and emotional states when we have yet to realize the importance of centering revolution in our systems thinking, revolutionary approaches to why we feel still so divided in an institutional context. Thank you, Elaine.
Thank you, Aaliyah. And Cindy and John, if you think of comments to that, but I want to pull us into our final question and then connect it with Samantha Giffin's question in the chat. As we think together and envision the future of this work and the importance of centering equity as we move forward and how we do that. And Samantha is thinking or asking us to think about how do we keep the sustainability of our work within the semester to semester timetable that we have within higher education is just one example, but also the staff and faculty and even student turnover, right? And so when our institutions have different operational structures than our community partners, I remember one faculty member that I talked to very early in my own research said poverty does not get resolved or solved within a semester, right? So this work is for the long haul. So as we envision this future together, I'm going to ask you very, very briefly, because we have 2 minutes remaining, and then we will close out and continue the conversation at 1 o'clock today, tomorrow, and on Thursday. John, 30 seconds, Cindy, 30 seconds, Aaliyah, and then Rochelle. Future, what's your vision, John?
Okay, one part of it is that we have to link up with each other, that we have to envision ways as faculty that we can partner with other faculty with the same community partners so that we don't leave them in the lurch when our course ends, so that we continue that work over time.
Thank you, John. Cindy, very quickly, and then Aaliyah, and then to Rochelle.
Yeah, to build off John's response, the way I saw it as the faculty fellow for the Center for Civic Engagement, we map it, right? We map it across our university. So it's across professors, across departments, across the entire institution. And then the responsibility doesn't lay on one person's shoulders. And that's how we can build that sustainable movement and energy across semesters.
Thank you, Cindy. Aaliyah?
Thank you. I think we center the practice of the sociological imagination, which is very deeply rooted in the civic imagination. It is making the familiar strange and doing something different.
Thank you, Aaliyah. Rochelle?
Yes, I agree with my colleagues here. I think we just need to collaborate and be intentional about that collaboration to ensure that it's reciprocal for all parties involved.
Thank you. Thank you, Rochelle. Thank you, John. Thank you, Cindy. Thank you, Aaliyah. And thank you, Cynthia, who is out there with the participants. Please look out for the call for proposals for chapters for the book that's coming out on centering equity and anti-racist community engaged pedagogy and principles. You'll find that on the Campus Compact website, and you will hear us talk about it through the week, and we can share that call for chapters. We invite you to participate in the conversation we have just opened up today, and we encourage it to be broad and deep as we go. Thank you all so very much, and enjoy this wonderful conference.